compromised life and a disastrous end. Now, under the first heading of a flawed beginning, a faulty beginning, things weren't right from the very outset. What I want to mention to you, first of all, is that the pros and cons of having a king had already been given to the people of Israel by Samuel when they first asked for a king. Do you remember that? We want a king like the nations round about us, somebody to lead us out into battle and bring us back again. And Samuel the prophet was very upset about this, because he could see that what was happening was not that they were rejecting him, as the Lord told him. They've not rejected you, they've rejected me from being king over them by asking for a king like the nations round about. And at that time, Samuel laid out the ways of a king. And maybe if we can just turn to that, I think it would be good in 1 Samuel 8. If you have your Bible, turn to that, because it does actually bear very much on what we're going to be thinking about from here on. Let's take 1 Samuel 8, 11 to 18, or 10 to 18. And there it says, "So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, 'These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He'll take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. He'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands, commanders of 50s, and some to plough his ground, to reap his harvest, to make his implements of war and equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and the vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants,' and so on." So do you get the impression that Samuel didn't approve of their request for a king? Well, as it turned out, with good reason. With good reason. Because the history of the kings of Israel, on the whole, is a bad history. There are some exceptions, some shining lights in the encircling gloom, as it were, but generally speaking, it was a bad history. So what Samuel is pointing out is that although in principle having a king might be a good thing, and in the economy of God we know that it was, because the king was the precursor of the Messiah king who was to come. We know that. But there were pros and cons. A king had power for good or for ill. And the critical thing for the man who was going to be king was not to rule, was not to lead by ruling, but to rule by leading. He had to be a leader of the people. It was for the king to rule under obligation to God, not as an absolute monarch, rather than to be an authoritarian figure who required the people to do his will simply because he was the king. And so Samuel was pointing out the worst tendencies of people who understood kingship in Israel in the wrong way. And Solomon, therefore, combined the best and the worst of kingship in his reign. He was devoted to the Lord. He did some great things for the Lord, and the Lord approved of those things, but he also was devoted to himself. And in the end, that seemed to take over, and that became the foremost motive in his life. And so, a man who prayed for wisdom and was granted it seemed to make a mess of it in the end. And that's a puzzle. That's a perplexing thing to think about. You know, in the United Kingdom, we go in for kings and queens. You don't have them here. I don't know if that's good or bad, but we had a king once. His name was James I. He used to be King of Scotland, and then when Elizabeth I died, he became King of England, 1603. He's the man who is responsible for the authorized version of the Bible, the King James version of the Bible. Well, James was, he came to the throne of Scotland as a 13-year-old, and he was under tutors. And he was brought up in a very strict Presbyterian way. A man by the name of Buchanan was appointed his tutor, and I think he used to give him a good whopping every day, and then teach him good Presbyterian doctrine and ways. They imagined that all those things belonged together. The result is that when he came to England, a much bigger kingdom, much more impressive and important than Scotland, he rebelled against all that. He rebelled against his Presbyterian upbringing and began to get delusions of grandeur. And he wrote a book, The Royal Gift. And in this, it was well written actually, he was a patron of literature. It was in his reign, of course, that Shakespeare and John Donne and Bacon and all those other great literary figures flourished, you see. And he was no mean scholar himself. And that's the point. He was very well read, he knew an awful lot. But he had this thing about the absolute monarch. And further down the line, when his son Charles I came to the throne, he paid the price of inheriting his father's foolish ideas because he lost his head, literally. The title, The Wisest Fool in Christendom, was given to James I. The wisest fool in Christendom. And as we think about King Solomon, maybe something of that comes to mind as we consider how this man, blessed of God and a blessing in the hands of God for so many years, actually turned out to be a fallen idol in the end. Now, so let's look at this flawed beginning. If Solomon needed to do anything from the outset, he needed to trust and obey the Lord. That was his compelling need at the time. But what actually happened? Well, you see, right from the beginning, there were complications. And there were fault lines appearing. David hadn't named his successor. Of course, most of the people thought it would be Solomon because that had been said. And of course, Bathsheba was his mother, and so forth. But no formal naming of a successor had taken place. Nevertheless, David called Solomon in before he died and gave him his final charge, his final admonition, if you like. And it's there in 1 Kings 2, verse 3, where he told him to keep the charge of the Lord, keep the commandment of the Lord. That's the bottom line here, David was saying. If you want to be king, this is what you have to do. But there was an awful lot of court intrigue at the time, and there was a rival, another son of David called Adonijah, and he got his kind of preemptive strike in and declared himself king. He had powerful allies. He had Abiathar the priest, he had Joab, the commander of David's army, and he went along and got himself proclaimed king. And Solomon spoke to his mother Bathsheba and said, speak to the king now about my position. And so she did, and eventually Solomon was proclaimed king. And the succession was eventually resolved by murder. Adonijah was murdered by Solomon's general Benaiah. And Adonijah had not handled things very well, we could say that. After he had had to relinquish the kingship, when he knew that Solomon was to be king, he went along to Bathsheba and said, well, why don't you work it out for me that I can have Abishag, David's concubine? Remember, they had a concubine to keep him warm when he was hypothermic at the end of his life. And so Bathsheba said to Solomon, well, Why not give Adonijah this concubine as a kind of consolation prize? And Solomon went berserk. He said, you might as well give him the kingdom. What was he talking about? Well, of course, David's concubines were a sign of his authority, in a sense. You know, when Absalom rebelled against David and went into Jerusalem, do you know the first thing he did? To take possession of the concubines of the harem. Because that was a sign of royal power. You know those 700 wives and 300 concubines that we read about of Solomon? I don't suppose he really loved all that many of them. It wasn't about that. It was about power. It was about authority. It was about image. And so Solomon had his enemies put down, and then he became king. So we read in chapter 2 of 1 Kings verse 46 that Solomon was established as king. But the path to that establishment had been a very difficult one indeed. And then there's this other ominous note. Of course, Solomon didn't think it was ominous, but it is in fact, because that's how chapter 3 began, with this mention of a dynastic marriage. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. There are two things there. Firstly, seeking help from Egypt, and secondly, having a pagan wife. Two things. Of course, they went together, but they were both dangerous. Throughout their history from this point on, from time to time, the Israelite kings sought help from Egypt. That's a strange and ironic thing when you think of their experience in Egypt. But nevertheless, they turned to Egypt, who had horses and chariots and were nearby and could help them when they were under threat of invasion. Isaiah thought nothing of this. He thought that's trash. That's absolute stupidity. Why turn to Egypt? In chapter 31, verse 1, he says, the Egyptians are man, not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and he who is helped will fall, and they will all perish together. The point he's making is, don't put your trust in horses. Psalm 20, verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord. That should have been Solomon's position, right from the outset, to trust and obey. But he didn't seem quite able to do that. And so what we've got is a very kind of mixed up beginning of things here. And I suppose, in addition to telling us about the importance of starting off on a right footing, and in Solomon's case, actually listening to what David, his father, had said to him about keeping that charge, keeping the commandment, we need to realize that nobody is above authority. The king, whoever the king is under God. He is under the law of God. You know, we had our civil war because of that, where the king claimed absolute power and authority, you see, and thought himself above God's law. And so Solomon should have realized that he was under authority, not above it. And also he should have understood the importance of marrying privilege and responsibility. And we need to do that too. So that's all I want to say about that first point. It was a flawed beginning, and there were lessons to be learned. Let's